The person talking to me never existed. I met him on a bench outside the old municipal library, the kind of place where pigeons argue over crumbs and the stone steps remember 100 years of shoes. I was there because my apartment felt too quiet and because my mother's last voicemail still lived on my phone like a bruise. He was already sitting, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if waiting for the day to begin again. "Do you ever feel like the city is holding its breath?" he asked without looking at me. I sat because it seemed impolite not to answer a question that gentle. "All the time," I said. "Especially here." He smiled then, not at me but at the air between us. He had a way of listening that made you feel as though your words were a cup he'd been thirsty for. We talked about small things first, the library's cracked windows, the way the light pooled at noon, and then about heavier ones, like how grief makes time behave badly. He never told me his name. I never asked. It felt like asking for an ID at a funeral. After that day, I found him everywhere. At the bus stop on rainy mornings, leaning back as if rain were applause. In the corner cafe where the barista always got my order wrong, he'd be there, stirring tea he never drank. Sometimes he'd say nothing, and sometimes he'd ask questions that felt like gifts. "What do you miss that you're pretending not to? Who taught you to be afraid of rest?" He never offered advice. He made space. When my mother died, people told me time would soften the edges. They said it with the confidence of people who had not recently tried to breathe through a room where someone's voice still echoed. The man on the bench did not tell me that. He said, "Some edges are meant to stay sharp. They keep us from forgetting what cut us open." I cried then, in public, without embarrassment. He didn't look away. Weeks passed. I began to measure my days by the likelihood of seeing him. If the sky was pale and the wind behaved, I would find him by the river. If the sky was dark and the wind mean, he would be under the awning of the closed florist, where the smell of wilted roses never quite left. He knew my routines before I spoke them. When I told him I'd quit my job at the call center, he nodded as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. "You're allowed to leave places that make you smaller," he said. It sounded like permission. Kindness has a way of changing the body. My shoulders lowered. My jaw unclenched. I slept longer. I noticed the color of things again. I started carrying change for the woman who sold newspapers near the train station because he once asked me why I didn't. "She's always there," I'd said. "Exactly," he replied. One afternoon, I asked him where he went when he wasn't here. He shrugged. "Where people go when they're not needed." I laughed because it felt like a joke, but something about the way he said it made me glance at his hands. They were steady. Real. I told him he was needed. He smiled that almost smile. "Then let's not test that." The city kept happening. Sirens. Weddings. Construction that ate the sidewalks. I found a part-time job at a community center, helping people fill out forms they didn't understand. It was good work. On my first day, I told him about it, how an old man had held my hand while we navigated a screen that kept timing out. "You have a talent for patience," he said. "It's contagious." He always noticed what I tried to hide. Sometimes, he spoke of things I hadn't told anyone. The guilt about the voicemail I never returned. The way I avoided my father's house because it smelled like my mother's sweaters. I asked him once how he knew. He tapped his temple. "People leave fingerprints on the world," he said. "You're very expressive." Then, on a morning that felt no different than the others, he wasn't there. The bench was empty. The pigeons argued alone. I waited longer than usual, checking my phone, pretending not to watch the space beside me. I told myself he had errands. I told myself the city was large. I told myself kindness didn't owe me a schedule. I saw him again 2 days later, by the florist. Relief came with a shameful rush. "You disappeared," I said, trying to sound light. He looked at me carefully, as if measuring something. "Did I?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I needed you." He nodded once. "And did you do all right?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to say the world had tilted. Instead, I told him about the woman at the center who'd cried when her benefits were approved, about the soup I'd made for my neighbor, about the way I'd called my father and let the silence be a bridge. He listened. "You did more than all right," he said. After that, he began to fade in small ways. He spoke less. He missed a bus stop. A week later, he wasn't at the river. When he did appear, he seemed thinner, less anchored. "Are you sick?" I asked. He smiled that almost smile. "I'm finishing," he said. I laughed again because it felt safer. "You don't get to finish," I said. "We're not done." "Maybe you are," he said gently. The first person I told about him was the barista. We were talking about the weather, the way people do when they don't know how to ask real questions. I mentioned the man who always stirred tea. She frowned. "No one sits there," she said. "We keep that chair stacked." I felt foolish. "He was there yesterday." She shook her head. "I would have noticed." I asked the woman with the newspapers. I asked the librarian who watched the steps like a guardian. I asked the guard at the river. Each answer was the same, offered kindly, with a tilt of concern. No one had seen him. No one remembered him. The city, which remembers everything, remembered nothing of the person who had made me feel most seen. I waited for him anyway. Days passed. My waiting changed. It became quieter. I started sitting on the bench even. It was cold, talking into the air as if the air were enough. "I did the thing you told me," I said once. I left the place that made me smaller. Another time, I forgave myself a little. I felt silly and brave at once. The truth arrived not as a revelation but as a series of soft confirmations. The way his questions echoed my own. The way his voice sounded like mine when I was very young. The way he knew the precise shape of my grief. One evening, cleaning out a drawer, I found my mother's old notebook. Inside were phrases she'd written when she was sick, things she wanted to remember to tell me. Questions. Permissions. "You're allowed to rest. What are you pretending not to miss?" My hands shook. The words were his. Or his were hers. Or both. I went back to the bench with the notebook. I read aloud. I cried. I laughed. "You never existed," I said to the empty space, and the sentence felt both true and incomplete. He existed in the way a bridge exists after you've crossed it, in the way kindness keeps working long after the hand that offered it has moved on. On the day I stopped looking for him, a boy sat beside me. He was waiting for his mother, he said, who worked late. He asked me if the city ever held its breath. I smiled, feeling the question land where it always had. "All the time," I said. "Especially here." We talked. I listened the way I'd been taught. When his mother came, she thanked me for keeping him company. I watched them leave, the space beside me warm. I still sit on the bench sometimes. The pigeons argue. The light pools. People pass with their private storms. I offer change. I ask questions. I make space. The person talking to me never existed, and because of that, he exists everywhere I choose to be kind.